The scream came from the west tower before the sun was even up. Caden was already moving before his mind caught up with his feet. He crossed the stone floor of his chamber in 3 long strides, pulled the door open so hard it cracked against the wall, and ran. Guards flattened themselves against the corridor as he passed. Nobody asked what was wrong. When the king ran like that, through his own halls, half-dressed, with his jaw locked tight, nobody asked anything at all. He reached the tower room and found 3 children curled on the floor, their small bodies shaking, their skin burning hot enough that he could feel the heat before he even touched them. A fever had swept through the young ones overnight, fast and merciless, the kind that could take a child before the sun rose twice. The old healer of the pack, a woman named Margaret who had served 3 kings before him, knelt beside them with shaking hands and a face gone pale with fear. "I don't have the strength left," she said, not looking up. "My hands don't work the way they used to. I sent word 2 days ago. Nobody has come." Caden knelt down beside the smallest child, a boy no older than 5, and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. The pulse was fast, too fast. His skin was damp, his breathing shallow. Caden had led men into battle. He had broken bones with his bare hands and walked away without blinking. But this small body burning under his palm terrified him in a way nothing else ever had. "Where did you send for help?" he asked. "The border village," Margaret said. "There is a healer there. Blind, they say, but the finest hands I have ever heard of. If she does not come, I do not know what more I can do." Caden stood. "Then I will go and bring her myself." "My lord, you cannot leave the pack now. Not with the challenge coming from the Eastern Territory, not with—" "Watch me," Caden said, and he was already walking. He took 2 riders with him, men who knew how to move fast and stay quiet, and they rode through the dark forest roads until the sky turned the color of ash. The border village was smaller than he expected, a cluster of low houses pressed against a hillside, smoke rising thin from a few chimneys. He did not wait for an introduction. He asked the first person he saw where the healer lived, and a young boy pointed toward a house at the edge of the village, its door painted a faded green. Caden knocked. No answer. He knocked again, harder. The door opened, and there she stood. She was not what he expected. He did not know exactly what he had expected, but it was not this. A woman with steady shoulders and unclouded confidence, her eyes a pale gray that did not quite focus on his face but did not seem lost either. Her hair was pulled back simply. She wore a plain dress with a leather satchel slung across her body, already prepared, as though she had known someone would come for her before they arrived. "You're the king," she said. It was not a question. "How do you know that?" "4 horses but only 3 riders breathing hard from riding," she said. "And you knock like someone who is used to doors opening the moment you touch them." Caden almost laughed, despite everything. "There are children dying in my pack. I need you to come." "Then we should stop talking," she said, and stepped past him toward the horses, her hand finding the satchel strap without looking, her steps sure on the uneven ground. Her name was Saren. She did not offer it right away. She offered it only once they were riding, when Caden asked, his voice rough from the cold morning air. "Saren," she said, "and before you ask, yes, I have always been like this. I do not need my eyes to know where I am going. I have learned other ways to see." "I wasn't going to ask that. You were thinking it." He said nothing, because she was right, and there did not seem to be any point in lying to a woman who could apparently hear the truth in his silence. They rode through the morning without much more conversation. Caden kept glancing back at her, watching the way she held herself steady on the horse, the way she tilted her head slightly at every new sound, a bird call, a snapped branch, the change in the wind as they passed through a clearing. She was mapping the world as she moved through it, building it out of sound and air and memory. He found himself oddly fascinated by it, though he did not examine why. When they reached the palace, Saren did not pause to take in the size of it, the towers, the banners, the guards who straightened at the sight of their king returning. She simply asked, "Where are the children?" And Caden led her straight to the tower room. Margaret looked up with something like relief breaking across her tired face. "You came." "Of course I came," Saren said, already kneeling beside the first child, her hands moving with quiet purpose over his small chest, his forehead, the inside of his wrist. "Tell me everything. When did the fever start? What did they eat yesterday? Has anyone else in the village where they play been sick?" Margaret answered as fast as she could, and Saren listened without interrupting, her fingers still working, checking each child in turn. Caden stood in the doorway and watched. He had seen healers work before. He had seen his own mother, years ago, tend to the sick with careful hands and worried eyes. But there was something different in the way Saren moved. No hesitation, no wasted motion. Every touch seemed to tell her something the rest of them could not see. "This is not just fever," she said finally. "There is something in the water they are drinking. A root, most likely, growing near the stream that feeds this side of the palace. It happens sometimes when the rains wash certain plants into slow-moving water. I need yarrow, and I need the bark of the red willow, and I need it now, not in an hour." "I don't have those here," Margit said, her voice breaking with frustration. "Then someone will have to find them," Saren said, and there was no anger in her voice, only urgency, the kind that moved people rather than frightened them. Caden turned to the guard standing behind him. "You heard her. Take 5 men. Search the eastern grove, near the old mill. Move." The guard was gone before Caden finished speaking. While they waited, Saren stayed beside the children, speaking to them in a low, steady voice, telling them stories about a river that could talk if you listened close enough, about a fox who learned to fly by tricking the wind into carrying him. The smallest boy, still shaking, managed a weak laugh at one point, and something in Caden's chest loosened just slightly at the sound. The riders returned before the sun reached its highest point, carrying bundles of bark and pale yellow flowers. Saren directed Margit through the preparation, her hands guiding the older woman's without ever taking over completely, teaching as she worked, patient even in crisis. When the medicine was ready, she fed it to each child herself, testing the temperature against her own wrist first, checking each small mouth to be sure they swallowed enough. By evening, the fever had begun to break. The smallest boy's breathing slowed into something calmer, something safer. Margit wept openly, holding his small hand, thanking every ancestor she could name. Saren simply sat back on her heels, exhausted but calm, and finally allowed herself to breathe out slowly. "They will live," she said. "All 3 of them. Watch the water source. This will happen again if nobody clears that stream." Caden had not realized he had been holding his breath until that moment. "I will have it cleared before the week is out." Saren nodded and rose to her feet, brushing dust from her dress, her satchel already slung back over her shoulder. "Then I will go home now." "You will stay," Caden said, before he had fully decided to say it. Saren turned her face toward him, that same pale gaze that did not focus but somehow still seemed to weigh him carefully. "Why would I do that?" "Because Margit cannot manage alone anymore, and you clearly know things she does not. Because 3 children nearly died today, and there will be more sickness before winter ends. Because I am asking you." "Kings do not usually ask," Saren said. "They tell." "I am asking," Caden repeated, and he meant it, though he could not fully explain to himself why it mattered so much that she understand the difference. Saren was quiet for a long moment. Somewhere below the tower, the pack was gathering for evening meal, voices rising in the courtyard. The ordinary sounds of a place returning to normal after a frightening day. She listened to all of it, her head tilted slightly, before she finally spoke again. "I will stay until the children are strong again," she said. "No longer than that. And I do not want a room fit for a queen or servants trailing behind me all day. Give me a simple place near the healer's stores, and leave me to my work." "Done," Caden said, feeling something in his shoulders release that he had not noticed carrying. She turned to go, guided by the sound of Margit's voice still murmuring softly to the children, and Caden watched her walk away with an odd, unfamiliar feeling settling behind his ribs. He had spent 7 years refusing every woman brought before him. Every carefully chosen bride paraded through his hall by hopeful elders. He had turned away beauty, wealth, bloodlines older than his own kingdom, and felt nothing each time but a tired, familiar emptiness. He had known Saren for less than a day, and already something in him felt different, though he could not yet name what it was. Outside, the sun was setting over the palace walls, painting the stones gold and orange, and somewhere in the tower room behind him, 3 children slept peacefully, for the first time in 2 days. Caden stood at the window for a long while, watching the light fade, thinking about pale gray eyes that saw more than most people ever would, and a voice that had not once trembled, not even when everything depended on her hands moving fast and true. He did not yet know her full story. He did not know why she lived alone at the edge of a border village, or why her hands moved with such fierce independence, as though she had spent a lifetime proving she needed no one's help. He did not know what waited for either of them in the months ahead, the challenges that would test his crown, the whispers that would rise against her simply for being different, the truth about his own past that he had buried so deep, even he sometimes forgot it was there. All he knew, standing at that window as darkness settled over his kingdom, was that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was looking forward to the morning. Because in the morning, she would still be here. The knife was already in the air before Rowan even shouted the warning. Saren heard the whistle of it cutting through the air a half second before the shout came, and she stepped sideways without thinking, the blade burying itself in the wooden post exactly where her shoulder had been standing. The training yard fell silent. Every young warrior practicing nearby froze mid-motion, staring at the healer who had just avoided a mistake that should have taken half her arm off. "Sorry," called the young man who had thrown it, his face draining of color. "I did not know anyone was standing there. I swear it, I was aiming for." "I know what you were aiming for," Saren said calmly, walking forward and pulling the knife free from the post with steady fingers. "Your grip is too loose on the release. That is why it drifted left instead of striking center." She held the handle out toward the sound of his breathing. "Try again, elbow tucked in this time." The young warrior took the knife back with visible confusion, glancing toward Rowan as if asking permission to be as astonished as he clearly felt. Rowan, the king's beta, simply shook his head and walked toward Saren with his arms crossed. "You should not be standing this close to the training yard," he said. "It's dangerous." "Everything in this palace seems to think danger only comes from outside it," Saren said. "I have lived my whole life around people who assume I need protecting from ordinary things. Knives thrown badly are the least of my worries." Rowan studied her for a long moment. He was a careful man, the kind who noticed everything and said very little about most of it, and Saren had come to recognize the particular quality of his silences over the past few weeks. This one felt like consideration rather than suspicion. "You have been here almost a month," he said. "The children have recovered. Margaret says her apprentices have learned more from watching you these few weeks than in the past 2 years combined, and yet you have not asked to leave. I said I would stay until the children were strong. They are strong. I have simply not found the moment to say goodbye yet." "Or you have not wanted to," Rowan said, and there was no accusation in it, only quiet observation, the kind a man makes when he has watched his king change in ways nobody else seems to have noticed yet. Saren did not answer that. She turned instead toward the sound of hooves entering the courtyard beyond the training yard, recognizing the particular rhythm of Caden's horse before anyone announced his return. He had been gone since dawn, inspecting the border after reports of unrest from the Eastern Territory, and though nobody had said so aloud, the whole palace had been listening for his return all day. He dismounted quickly, and Saren could hear the tension in the way his boots hit the ground, harder than usual, his breathing still elevated from a long ride pushed too fast. "What happened?" she asked, before he had even crossed the distance between them. Caden stopped in front of her, surprised, as he often seemed to be, at how easily she read him without ever needing to see his face. "The Eastern Pack has sent a formal challenge. Their alpha, a man named Garrick, claims my right to rule is weakened because I have refused every match brought before me for 7 years. He says a king without a chosen mate is a king without loyalty behind him, and he intends to test that claim before the next full moon." "That is absurd," Rowan said, his voice sharp. "Your right to rule was earned in blood, not in marriage." "Garrick does not care what is fair," Caden said. "He cares what will convince the smaller packs to side with him instead of me. And unfortunately, doubt is easier to plant than loyalty is to prove." Saren stood quietly, listening to the frustration coiled tight in Caden's voice, the exhaustion underneath it, the particular strain of a man carrying far more weight than anyone around him seemed to fully understand. She had spent enough evenings near him now, tending small injuries, sharing quiet meals when neither of them felt like talking to anyone else, to recognize the sound of him trying to hold everything together with his bare hands. "Then prove him wrong," she said simply. "How?" "Not by finding a wife to parade in front of him, by being the kind of king your people already know you are. Fear moves fast, but it does not last. If your pack trusts you, this Garrick's claims will mean nothing, no matter how loudly he makes them." Caden was quiet for a moment. "You make it sound simple." "I did not say it was simple, I said it was true." Rowan glanced between the two of them with an expression Saren could not see but could certainly sense, something careful and thoughtful, the look of a man quietly filing away information he intended to return to later. "I will gather the elders," he said. "We should discuss how to respond before Garrick's messengers spread this further." He left them alone in the training yard, the last of the young warriors having drifted away sometime during the conversation, leaving only the two of them and the fading afternoon light. "Walk with me," Caden said. They walked without any particular destination, following the outer wall of the palace grounds, where the noise of the courtyard faded into birdsong and wind moving through the trees beyond. Saren had learned this path well over the past weeks, the exact number of steps between the training yard and the old garden gate, the place where the stone path grew uneven and required more careful footing. Caden had noticed, too, the way he slowed his own pace without comment whenever they reached that stretch, never mentioning it, simply adjusting. Can I ask you something? Hayden said, after a long stretch of comfortable silence. You can ask. I make no promises about answering. Fair enough. He hesitated, which surprised her, because he rarely hesitated about anything. Why did you become a healer? Most people assume it is because you cannot do other things. I have seen the way you move, the way you fought off that boy's mistake this morning before anyone else even reacted. You could have been a warrior, a leader, anything. Saren considered the question carefully before answering. When I was young, everyone around me decided what I could and could not be based on what my eyes could not do. My own family believed I needed protecting more than teaching. It made me furious, the assumption that my hands were somehow less capable simply because my eyes worked differently. So I decided to become the one thing nobody expected, someone whose hands people needed, someone who saved lives instead of being saved. That sounds lonely, Caden said quietly. It was, for a long time, Saren admitted. Being the person everyone needs and nobody truly sees is its own kind of lonely. But I chose it, and there is a difference between loneliness that is forced on you, and loneliness you walk into with open eyes, so to speak. She allowed herself a small, wry smile at her own choice of words, and Caden laughed despite himself, a real laugh, low and surprised. You joke about it easily. If I did not joke about it, I would have to feel sorry for myself, and I have never had the patience for that. They reached the garden gate and stopped there, the last light of the day settling gold and quiet over the overgrown roses climbing the old stone wall. Caden reached out without thinking and brushed a fallen petal from her shoulder, the gesture small and unplanned, and Saren went very still under his hand. You did that without thinking, she said softly. I did. Nobody touches me without thinking. They either avoid it entirely, afraid of doing something wrong, or they make a show of helping, as if I need announcing before I can be touched at all. She turned her face slightly toward him. You have never done either. I did not realize there was a difference to get right or wrong, Caden said. You are simply a person standing beside me. It did not occur to me to treat it as anything more complicated than that. Something shifted in the quiet space between them, something neither of them named aloud, though both of them felt it settle like a held breath finally released. Saren did not step away, and Caden did not move his hand, and for a long moment, the noise of the palace behind them seemed very far away indeed. Your beta suspects something, Saren said eventually, breaking the stillness. Rowan suspects everything. It is his job. He is not wrong to suspect this. Caden looked at her carefully, though of course she could not see the look, only the change in his breathing, the way his voice dropped slightly lower when he answered. No, he said. He is not wrong. They stood there a while longer, the sun disappearing fully behind the western hills, the first stars beginning to prick through the darkening sky, and neither of them moved to end the moment, both of them aware that something had quietly, irrevocably begun. The council chamber went silent the moment Saren stepped through the door, and she felt every eye turned toward her even though she could not see a single one of them. She had not been summoned often to this part of the palace, and she understood immediately, from the particular quality of the silence, that this was not a friendly meeting. The air smelled of old wood and candle smoke, and beneath it, something colder, the smell of people who had already decided what they thought before she ever opened her mouth. Thank you for coming, said a voice she recognized as belonging to an elder named Edwin, a man whose tone always carried a practiced kindness that did not quite reach sincerity. Please, sit. I would rather stand, Saren said. Say what you called me here to say. A pause. She could hear someone shifting uncomfortably in their seat, the creak of old wood, someone else clearing their throat. Edwin spoke again, his voice smoothing over whatever awkwardness had passed silently between the council members. You have done excellent work for this pack, he began. Nobody disputes your skill. The children owe you their lives, and Margit speaks of you with nothing but admiration. There is a but coming, Saren said. I can hear it in your voice. Another elder, a woman this time, spoke up, her tone sharper than Edwin's. The king is facing a challenge to his rule. Garrick of the Eastern Pack has made his claim public, and it grows louder every day. Our people need reassurance right now, not distraction. And there is talk, healer, that the king has grown distracted. By me, Saren said flatly. By you, the woman confirmed. It does not matter what is true and what is rumor. What matters is what the pack believes, and what Garrick's people are already saying to weaken our position. A blind woman cannot stand beside an alpha king in formation, cannot lead a hunt, cannot hold a blade in battle should the day ever demand it. Our queen, whenever she is chosen, must be able to do all of these things, or the pack will see her as a weakness rather than a strength. Saren stood very still, listening to the words land one by one, feeling the old familiar shape of them settle over her shoulders like a coat she had worn 1,000 times before and hated every single time. She had heard variations of this speech her entire life, delivered by different mouths in different rooms, always with the same underlying assumption, that her eyes defined the limits of her worth. "I understand," she said finally, her voice even. "You want me gone before I embarrass your king further. We want what is best for the pack," Edwin said gently. "Surely you understand that." "I understand it perfectly," Saren said. "I have understood it my entire life. Let me ask you something before I go." She turned her face toward the sound of Edwin's breathing, then toward the woman who had spoken so sharply, then toward the rest of the room, gathering the full weight of their attention before she continued. "Which one of you sat beside Rowan's daughter 3 winters ago, when the fever took hold of her lungs so badly that Margaret herself said there was nothing more to be done? I have heard the story from 3 different people since I arrived. They all say the same thing, that an old healer from the border villages came in the dead of night and worked for 6 hours straight to save a child everyone else had already begun to mourn. That healer was blind then, just as she is blind now. Nobody questioned her hands the night that child's life depended on them." The room had gone very quiet. "That is different," the sharp-voiced woman said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "Is it?" Saren said. "Or is it only different now, when it is convenient to make it so?" Nobody answered her. She let the silence stretch long enough to make her point clearly, then reached down and picked up her satchel from where she had set it by the door, the leather strap familiar and steady beneath her fingers. "I did not come here seeking a crown," she said. "I came here because sick children needed hands that knew what to do, and I stayed because there was more work still to be done. If the pack decides my presence is a weakness rather than a strength, that is the pack's decision to make. But do not pretend this is about formation drills or hunting parties. This is about comfort. It is easier for all of you to imagine a queen who looks the way queens have always looked than to imagine one who does not fit the picture in your heads." She turned to leave, and Edwin's voice followed her, quieter now, almost apologetic. "We only wish to protect the king's position." "Then protect it honestly," Saren said, without turning back. "Do not hide behind formation drills when what you truly fear is change." She walked out of the chamber with steady steps, her chin level, her satchel swinging gently against her hip, and it was not until she reached the quiet of the garden path outside that she allowed herself to stop, to breathe, to feel the old, familiar ache settle behind her ribs. She had told herself years ago that words like these no longer had the power to wound her. Standing there in the cool evening air, she realized that it had always been a lie she told herself for convenience. She did not hear Rowan approach until he was nearly beside her, his footsteps deliberately heavier than usual, a courtesy she had come to recognize as his particular way of announcing himself without embarrassing her by mentioning it directly. "I heard what happened in there," he said. "News travels fast in this palace. It does when the walls are thin and half the guards were listening at the door." He paused. "For what it is worth, not everyone on that council agrees with Edwin and Meredith. Some of us think you have done more for this pack in a few weeks than most healers manage in years. That is kind of you to say." "It is not kindness, it is simply the truth." Rowan's voice grew quieter. "The king does not know about this meeting yet. He does not need to know. He will find out regardless. He always does." Rowan hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. "I have served Caden since we were both very young. I have watched him refuse every woman brought before him for 7 years, each time with the exact same tired expression, as though he were fulfilling an obligation rather than living a life. I had begun to believe he simply did not want what the rest of us want, a partner, a home built with someone else in it." He paused again. "I do not believe that anymore." Saren said nothing, though something in her chest tightened at his words. "Whatever the council decides," Rowan continued, "know that some of us see clearly enough to recognize good work when it is standing right in front of us. Do not let Edwin's fear convince you otherwise." He left her there in the garden, the sound of his footsteps fading back toward the palace, and Saren stood alone for a long while, listening to the wind move through the trees, thinking about a lifetime spent proving her worth to people who had already decided it before ever meeting her. She thought of her satchel, packed with steady hands, ready to leave 100 times over the years whenever a room like that one convinced her she was not wanted. She thought, too, of a hand brushing a fallen petal from her shoulder without a moment of hesitation, and wondered, for the first time in longer than she could remember, whether staying might be worth the risk of being hurt again. Caden found out about the council meeting before the sun had fully set, and by the time he reached the garden, his temper had already burned down to something cold and dangerous. the kind of quiet fury that made even seasoned warriors step carefully around him. He found Saren still sitting on the low stone bench near the old rose wall, her satchel resting beside her, her face turned upward as though she were listening to the last birds settling into the trees for the night. She heard him coming, of course, and did not turn immediately, letting him approach at his own pace. "Rowan told me," Caden said, his voice tight. "I assumed he would. Edwin had no right to summon you like that. No right to speak to you that way. He is an elder of your council," Saren said calmly. "He has every right within your traditions to raise concerns. That does not make it right." Caden sat down heavily on the bench beside her, running a hand through his hair, frustration radiating off him in waves she could feel even without seeing his face. "I built nothing in this pack by accident. Every decision, every law, every alliance, I built with intention, and the one thing I have never had control over, from the moment I became king, is what people whisper behind closed doors." "Then let them whisper," Saren said. "I am not asking you to silence anyone on my behalf." "That is exactly the problem," Caden said, turning to face her fully now. "You never ask for anything on your own behalf. You walked into that meeting alone. You defended yourself alone. And you would have walked away from this palace alone if Rowan had not told me what happened. You do not let people fight for you, Saren. Not once. In all the weeks you have been here, have I seen you allow anyone to stand beside you when things grew difficult." Saren was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice had lost some of its usual steadiness. "Because the moment I let someone fight for me, I become something fragile in their eyes. Something that needs protecting rather than something capable in its own right. I learned a long time ago that the only way to be taken seriously was to prove I needed no one's help at all." "You do not have to prove that to me," Caden said quietly. "I know that now," Saren said. "I think I have known it for a while. It does not change how difficult it is to unlearn a habit built over an entire lifetime." Caden reached out, slower this time, more deliberate, and took her hand in his. She let him, her fingers curling naturally around his without hesitation, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all, simply sitting together in the cooling evening air, the weight of the day settling quietly between them. "They are not wrong about one thing," Caden said eventually. "I am not an easy thing to be beside. There is a challenge coming from the east that could cost me everything I have built. There are elders in my own council who would rather see me married to a stranger with the right bloodline than happy with someone who actually understands me. And there is a part of my own past, Saren, that I have never told a single living soul, not even Rowan, and some days it feels heavy enough to crush me on its own. Neither am I an easy thing to be beside," Saren said softly. "I have spent my whole life proving I do not need anyone, and now here I am, sitting beside a king, terrified of exactly how much I have already come to need him." She turned her face toward him fully. "But here we both are." "Here we both are," Caden repeated, and something in his chest loosened at the simple honesty of it, a feeling he had not experienced in longer than he could remember. Not the practiced calm of a king managing his people, but something rawer, something real. The wind picked up gently around them, carrying the scent of the roses climbing the old stone wall, and neither of them moved to end the moment, both of them sensing that something important had settled quietly into place between them, something neither political pressure nor council disapproval could easily undo. "Whatever comes," Caden said finally, "the challenge from Garrick, the whispers from Edwin's council, whatever it is, I do not intend to face it by turning you away. I have spent 7 years turning women away, because none of them ever wanted the man underneath the crown. You are the first person who has looked past it entirely, without even needing your eyes to do it." Saren smiled, small and genuine, the first fully unguarded smile Caden had seen from her since she arrived. "Then do not turn me away," she said simply. "That is all I would ask of you, if I were the kind of person who asked for things." "You are exactly that kind of person," Caden said. "You simply have not practiced it very often. Perhaps I am willing to start." They sat together as full darkness settled over the garden, stars scattering slowly across the sky above them, and for the first time since his mother had died and left him a crown too heavy for one man to carry alone, Caden felt something close to peace settle into the space where exhaustion usually lived. Whatever waited for them beyond the garden wall, the challenge, the council, the truth he had not yet found the courage to speak aloud, he found himself facing it for the first time not with dread, but with something dangerously close to hope. The messenger arrived at dusk, breathless and bleeding from a shallow cut above his eyebrow, shouting that the border patrol had been ambushed near the eastern ridge. Caden was already pulling on his armor before the messenger finished his report, and within minutes the courtyard filled with warriors mounting horses, torches being lit against the coming darkness, Rowan barking orders with the particular sharpness he reserved for moments when everything needed to happen at once. Saren stood at the edge of it all, listening to the chaos organize itself into purpose, her hands already moving toward her satchel out of pure instinct. "Stay here," Kaidan told her, swinging up onto his horse. "This is not a healer's errand. This is a fight. Fights produce wounds," Saren said simply. "Wounds need healers. I am coming." There was no time to argue, and some part of Kaidan suspected he would have lost the argument anyway. He nodded once, and Rowan helped her onto a horse of her own, murmuring quiet directions about the terrain as they rode hard into the deepening night. The ambush site was worse than the messenger's account had suggested. Garrick's men had struck the border patrol in a narrow pass, using the terrain to their advantage, and by the time Kaidan's forces arrived, 3 of his own warriors lay wounded among the rocks, and the attackers had already melted back into the tree line, leaving chaos and injury behind them like a calling card. Saren worked fast, moving between the wounded with practiced hands, directing others to help her lift and carry, calling out instructions in a voice that cut cleanly through the noise and confusion. She had nearly finished stabilizing the last of the 3 when she heard it, the particular sound of Kaidan's breathing gone ragged, a sharp intake of air followed by a low grunt he tried and failed to hide. "You are hurt," she said, already moving toward the sound of him. "It is nothing. Focus on the others. The others are stable. You are not." She reached him and found the source immediately, her fingers brushing against torn fabric and warm blood along his ribs, a deep gash where a blade had caught him during the fighting. "This needs attention now, not later. Saren, there are still men out there who could. Rowan has already sent riders after them," she said firmly. "You are no use to this pack bleeding out in a mountain pass, because pride would not let you admit an injury. Sit down." He sat, more out of exhaustion than obedience, and Saren worked quickly by torchlight, cleaning the wound with steady hands, while Rowan organized the retreat back toward the palace. By the time they reached the infirmary, the worst of the danger had passed, and Saren insisted on finishing the work properly, away from the chaos of the courtyard, in the quiet of the healer's room, where Margit kept her stores. The infirmary was empty except for the 2 of them. Margit had gone to check on the other wounded, and the quiet settled around them like something almost sacred, broken only by the soft sounds of Saren's careful work and Kaidan's controlled breathing. "This is deeper than I first thought," she said, her fingers tracing the wound's edges with practiced precision. "You will need stitches. Hold still. I have had worse. That does not make this better." She worked in silence for several minutes, her hands sure despite the low light, threading the needle by feel alone, a skill she had perfected over years of necessity. Kaidan watched her face as she worked, the intense concentration there, the complete absence of hesitation even in something as delicate as this. Her fingers moved further along his ribs to check for additional injury, and that was when she found it. An older scar, long healed but still faintly raised beneath her fingertips, running in a straight, deliberate line across his side, entirely unlike the jagged, chaotic pattern of a battle wound. Her hands stilled. Kaidan went very quiet. Saren did not ask. She had learned long ago that some wounds revealed themselves only when a person was ready to speak of them, and forcing the question rarely helped anyone heal faster. She simply continued her work, her touch gentle now over that old scar, acknowledging it without demanding explanation. "You are not going to ask," Kaidan said eventually, his voice low. "Would you tell me if I did?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Saren nearly finished the stitching on the fresh wound entirely before he spoke again. "My mother died 6 years ago," he said finally. "Not from illness, not from battle. She took her own life, quietly, in the same room where I was born, and I was the one who found her. I have never told anyone the full truth of what happened in the months before, the way the crown pressed down on her until there was nothing left to press. I carried a grief so heavy after that I did not know how to hold it, and there was a night, not long after, when I nearly followed her down the same path. Rowan found me before it went too far. Nobody else knows, not even him, not the full truth of it, only that there was an accident with a blade." Saren's hands had gone still against his skin, listening, absorbing every word without flinching, without offering the kind of pity that made people feel smaller rather than seen. "I am not asking for pity," Kaidan said quietly. "I am simply telling you because you found it, and because you did not ask, and somehow that made it easier to say aloud than it has ever been before. I am not going to pretend that scar does not matter," Saren said finally, resuming her work with steady hands. "It matters. What happened to you matters. But it does not change anything about how I see you, or how capable you are, or how much this pack needs the man sitting in front of me right now." She tied off the final stitch and sat back slightly. "You survived something that should have broken you completely. That is not weakness. That is the opposite of it. Caden let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, something in his chest finally loosening after years of carrying that particular weight alone. "Thank you," he said simply. "For the stitches, or for listening?" "Both." Saren allowed herself a small, tired smile as she began packing away her supplies, the quiet of the infirmary settling comfortably around them once more. "You should rest," she said. "Tomorrow will bring its own difficulties, and you will need your strength for them." "Stay a while longer," Caden said. "Just a while." She did, settling into the chair beside his cot, and neither of them spoke much more that night, but something between them had shifted permanently. A wound both old and new finally given air to breathe, and for the first time in 6 long years, Caden fell asleep without the familiar weight of his secret pressing down alone in the dark. 10 days after the ambush, a messenger from the Eastern Pack arrived at the palace gates carrying a formal declaration, and by midday, every soul within the walls knew that the challenge was no longer a rumor but a certainty. The full council gathered in the great hall this time, not the smaller private chamber where Saren had first faced their questions. Every elder sat in their assigned place along the long table, and behind them, warriors and pack members filled the standing space along the walls, drawn by the news, hungry to understand what it meant for their future. Caden sat at the head of the table, his expression carved from stone, and Rowan stood at his shoulder like a wall of quiet support. Garrick's messenger, a lean man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried practiced arrogance, read the declaration aloud for all to hear. "My Alpha, Garrick of the Eastern Territory, formally challenges Caden's claim to lead this pack, citing weakness demonstrated through 7 years without a chosen mate, and further weakness shown through reliance on outside influence rather than pack tradition. The challenge will be settled at the rising of the new moon, 12 days from this reading, either through combat or through Caden's public acknowledgement of a bonded mate who meets the traditions of pack leadership." The hall erupted into murmurs, dozens of voices rising at once, some outraged, some worried, some simply curious about how their king would respond. Caden raised a hand, and the noise died down slowly, reluctantly. "Tell Garrick I accept the terms of his challenge," Caden said, his voice steady despite the storm building behind his eyes, "and tell him I will meet whichever form it takes." The messenger bowed stiffly and departed, leaving behind a hall thick with tension. It was Edwin who spoke first once the doors closed behind the departing rider, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who believed he was about to be proven right. "My king, this is precisely the situation I warned of," Edwin said. "Garrick has built his entire challenge on the absence of a proper mate. If you intend to face him in combat alone, you risk everything on physical strength. But if you intend to answer with a bonded mate, the pack must be certain that mate meets every expectation of leadership our traditions demand." "Meaning what exactly?" Caden said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Meaning the healer cannot be that answer," Edwin said, and several other elders nodded, though not all of them, Saren noted, listening carefully from her place near the edge of the hall. "A queen who cannot see the battlefield, who cannot lead a hunt, who cannot stand in formation beside her king, gives Garrick exactly the weakness he is hunting for. It would not silence his claim, it would confirm it. She healed 3 children who would have died without her," Caden said. "She saved warriors on that mountain pass 10 days ago with her own 2 hands while blood soaked through her sleeves. Tell me again what weakness looks like, Edwin, because I am no longer certain either of us are using the same definition." "I am not questioning her skill," Edwin said carefully. "I am questioning what our people will believe when Garrick's warriors mock her in the field, when rival packs whisper that our king chose comfort over strength. Perception matters as much as truth in matters of leadership, my king. You know this better than anyone." The hall had gone very quiet, every eye moving between Caden and the elder, waiting to see which way the moment would break. Saren felt the weight of dozens of unseen stares settling on her, the particular pressure of being discussed as though she were an object on a scale rather than a person standing among them. "May I speak?" she said, stepping forward before Caden could answer. The hall fell silent entirely. Edwin gestured stiffly for her to continue, clearly uncomfortable, but unwilling to refuse in front of so many witnesses. "You are afraid of what Garrick's warriors will say about me," Saren said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "Let me ask you something in return. When those 3 children were dying of fever, did anyone in this hall ask whether my eyes could see well enough to save them? When warriors bled out on a mountain pass 10 days ago, did anyone pause to question whether blindness made my hands less capable of closing a wound? Nobody questioned it then, because in that moment, results mattered more than appearances. I would ask this council to remember that results are the only thing that will actually determine whether this pack survives Garrick's ambitions. Not appearances, not whispers, results. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, an older elder near the end of the table, a quiet woman who had said little throughout the entire proceeding, rose slowly to her feet. "I lost my son to a border skirmish 2 winters past," she said, her voice trembling slightly with age and old grief. "Nobody could save him in time. If this woman had been here then, perhaps he would still be sitting beside me today. I do not care what Garrick's warriors whisper across a battlefield. I care what keeps our children alive and our warriors standing. This council would do well to remember which matters more." A murmur of agreement rippled through parts of the standing crowd, though Edwin's expression remained tight and unconvinced. Caden watched the room carefully, gauging the shifting currents of support and doubt, before speaking again. "The challenge will be met at the new moon," he said finally, his voice carrying clear authority. "How I choose to meet it remains my decision alone, not this council's, and not Garrick's. I have led this pack for 7 years without needing permission for my choices, and I do not intend to start seeking it now." He rose from his seat, signaling the end of the gathering, and the hall began to empty slowly, voices rising once more into 100 separate conversations, opinions already forming and spreading like wildfire through dry grass. Saren remained near the edge of the room as the crowd thinned, feeling the particular exhaustion that came from being discussed rather than heard, even when she had finally been given the chance to speak for herself. Rowan found her there a few minutes later. "That was well said. It did not seem to change many minds." "It changed enough," Rowan said. "Edwin will never fully come around, but the woman who spoke, and several others who nodded along with her, those matter more than Edwin's opinion in the long run. The pack remembers who saves their children long after they forget who won an argument in a formal hall." Saren allowed herself a tired breath, the weight of the day settling heavy across her shoulders. 12 days, she said quietly. 12 days, Rowan agreed, and a great deal still to decide before then. Outside, the afternoon had turned gray and heavy, with the promise of rain, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, the countdown toward the new moon had already begun, ticking forward with a patience that cared nothing for hearts still deciding what they were willing to risk. Rain fell steadily against the windows of the healer's quarters that night, a soft, constant rhythm that Saren had always found comforting, though tonight it did little to settle the restlessness sitting heavy in her chest. She was sorting dried herbs by touch and smell, a task she usually found soothing, when she heard familiar footsteps approaching down the corridor, slower than usual, hesitant in a way that was unlike him. "You do not usually knock this quietly," she said before he had even reached the door. Caden stepped inside, shaking rain from his shoulders. "I was not certain you would want company tonight. I would rather have company than sit alone thinking about 12 days and a countdown I cannot stop." He settled into the chair across from her small table, watching her hands continue their steady work even as her mind clearly sat elsewhere. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You never speak of your family. Not once. In all the weeks you have been here." Saren's hands paused briefly over the herbs before continuing. "There is not much to say. My mother died when I was young, before my blindness ever became something anyone needed to understand. My father remarried a woman who saw me as a burden rather than a daughter, someone to be managed rather than raised. When I came of age enough to leave, I did, and I have built my own life since, far from any of them." "Do you regret leaving?" "Never," she said, with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "I regret only how long it took me to understand that leaving was allowed. For years I believed I owed them patience, gratitude, an obligation to prove I was worth the trouble of keeping around. It took a long time to understand that a home which requires you to constantly prove your worth is not truly a home at all." Caden was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of what she had shared. "I am sorry," he said finally, "that you had to learn that lesson so young, and so painfully." "Do not be sorry for me," Saren said, though her voice had softened. "It shaped me into someone capable of standing alone in council halls, full of people who would rather see me gone. I would not trade that strength, even for an easier childhood." "You do not have to stand alone anymore," Caden said quietly. "Not with me." Saren set down the herbs entirely now, turning her full attention toward him. "I know that, in my mind. My heart is still learning to believe it. Old habits built over an entire lifetime do not dissolve simply because someone finally offers something different." "Then let me help you unlearn them," Caden said, slowly, however long it takes. She smiled, small and genuine, and reached across the table until she found his hand, her fingers curling around his with quiet certainty. "I would like that," she said, though I warn you now, I am a difficult student. Old fears do not give up their ground easily. Neither does old grief, Caden said. We can be difficult together then. They sat together for a long while, the rain continuing its steady rhythm outside, and eventually Saren rose and pulled a second chair beside her own, guiding Caden toward a low table where several sharpened tools lay arranged in careful order. Since you are here, she said, let me show you something. Everyone in this palace assumes my hands only know how to heal. They forget that hands capable of closing a wound with precise, steady pressure are equally capable of other things. She placed a small blade in his hand, then guided his fingers along her own wrist, showing him the exact pressure points a person might use to disarm an attacker without ever needing to see the blade coming. You have trained for this, Caden said, surprised. Every day of my life, Saren said. People assume that because I cannot see a fist coming, I cannot defend against one. I learned long ago to prove them wrong, quietly, without announcement, simply by being ready whenever the moment demanded it. Caden watched her demonstrate the movement again, precise and confident, and felt something shift in his understanding of her, an appreciation deepening into something that went beyond simple admiration. Edwin should see this, he said. It might change his opinion on formations and battlefields rather quickly. Edwin has already decided what he believes, Saren said. Demonstrations rarely change minds already made up, but perhaps one day, if the moment ever truly demands it, he will see for himself. They practiced together a while longer, Caden genuinely startled more than once by the speed and precision of her reflexes, until the rain outside finally began to soften into a gentle patter, and exhaustion settled comfortably over both of them. Stay a while longer, Saren said, echoing the words he had spoken to her once in the infirmary. Just a while. He did, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them, 12 days stretching ahead like an uncertain road. But for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, neither of them faced it entirely alone. Word came on the 9th day that 2 smaller packs allied with the Northern Territory had quietly withdrawn their support, choosing instead to wait and see how Garrick's challenge would resolve before committing loyalty either way. Caden received the news in silence, standing at the window of his chamber long after the messenger had gone, watching storm clouds gather over the eastern hills. Rowan stood nearby, his own expression carefully controlled, though the tension in his shoulders told its own story. This is exactly what Garrick wanted, Rowan said, doubt spreading before a single blow has even been struck. I know what he wanted, Caden said, knowing it does not make it easier to stop. Within the palace itself, the mood had shifted noticeably over the past several days. Warriors who had once greeted Saren with easy respect now offered careful, measured nods instead. Uncertain how openly to associate with a woman some now blamed for weakening their king's position. Whispers followed her through corridors that had once felt welcoming, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever her footsteps drew near. She heard all of it, of course. Her ears had always caught what others assumed she would miss. Margit found her late one evening in the healer's stores, quietly packing a satchel with far more purpose than any simple errand required. What are you doing? Margit asked, though her voice suggested she already suspected the answer. What I should have done days ago, Saren said, her hands moving steadily despite the tightness in her chest. Every whisper spreading through this palace grows louder because I remain here. 2 packs have already withdrawn their support. If I leave before the new moon, Garrick loses his strongest argument, and Caden faces this challenge without doubt weighing down his own people's loyalty. You would leave him now, of all times when he needs steady ground beneath him more than ever. I would leave him precisely because he needs steady ground, Saren said, her voice thick with an emotion she rarely allowed herself to show. I have caused nothing but division since I arrived. Sick children healed, wounded warriors saved. None of that matters if 2 allied packs abandon him because of who stands beside him. I will not be the reason he loses everything he has built. And what of what he wants? Margit asked gently. Have you considered that, or only what you believe is best for everyone else? Saren's hand stilled over the satchel. It does not matter what either of us wants, if wanting it costs him his crown. She finished packing in silence, Margit watching with an expression of worried helplessness, unable to find further words that might change the healer's mind. By the time Saren slung the satchel over her shoulder and moved toward the door, word had already begun to travel through the palace, carried by servants and guards who noticed her preparations and drew their own conclusions. Caden reached her chamber before she had even crossed the threshold, his expression a mixture of disbelief and something rawer beneath it, something close to panic. Tell me this is not true, he said. It is true, Saren said, her voice steady though her chest ached with the effort of keeping it so. I am leaving before the new moon. It is the only way to remove Garrick's strongest argument, and I will not stand here and watch you lose everything you have built because of me. You do not get to make that decision alone, Caden said, his voice rising with an intensity she had rarely heard from him. I am not asking your permission, Saren said. I am telling you what I have decided, because it is the right decision for this pack, whatever it costs either of us personally. It is not the right decision, Caden said, stepping closer, his voice dropping into something quieter, more desperate. Saren, please, do not do this. Caden, she said softly, and for the first time her composure cracked slightly, grief bleeding through the careful control she had maintained throughout the entire conversation. I have spent my whole life being told I was a burden others had to carry despite themselves. I will not become the reason you lose your crown, your pack, everything your mother built before you. I care about you too much to let that happen. And I care about you too much to let you walk away believing that leaving is somehow an act of love, rather than another wound layered on top of everything else you have already survived, Caden said, his voice breaking slightly on the last words. Please, give me until morning. Just until morning, before you decide anything final. Saren stood very still, torn between the certainty that had carried her through packing that satchel, and the raw plea in his voice, a plea unlike anything she had heard from him before, stripped entirely of the careful control a king usually wore like armor. Until morning, she said finally, softly, but nothing you say will change the truth of what leaving would accomplish. Let me try anyway, Caden said. Please. She nodded slowly, and he left her there in the doorway, disappearing down the corridor with hurried steps, leaving her standing alone with her satchel still slung over her shoulder, and her heart caught somewhere between the decision she had made and the desperate hope in his voice that had, for just a moment, made her wonder if she had gotten something terribly wrong. Outside, thunder rolled low over the eastern hills, and the storm that had been building for days finally broke loose across the sky, rain hammering against the palace windows, as though the whole world had chosen that exact moment to hold its breath alongside her. Caden did not sleep that night. He sat alone in his mother's old study, a room he rarely entered anymore, surrounded by the faded books and quiet portraits of a woman whose absence had shaped every decision he had made since her death. Rowan found him there near midnight, drawn by a servant's worried report that the king had not returned to his own chamber. He entered quietly, and found Caden sitting motionless at the old writing desk, a single candle burning low beside him. You should be resting, Rowan said. Tomorrow will demand everything you have. She is leaving, Caden said, not looking up. Before the new moon. She believes it will save my crown. Rowan was quiet for a long moment before pulling up a chair and sitting beside his king, the way he had done countless times over the years whenever the weight of leadership grew too heavy for one man to carry silently. Will it? He asked carefully. Save your crown, I mean. Perhaps, Caden admitted. Garrick's whole challenge rests on convincing this pack and its allies that I lead with weakness rather than strength. Removing her removes his easiest argument. And is that argument worth more to you than she is? Caden finally looked up, something raw and unguarded in his expression that Rowan had not seen since the darkest months following the Queen's death. No, he said simply. It is not worth more. Nothing is worth more. Then tell her that, Rowan said, not with careful words designed to convince a council, but with the truth. The whole truth. The kind you have never once let anyone see. Not even me. Not fully. Caden was quiet for a long time, staring at the candle flame flickering low against the darkness. I have spent 7 years turning away every woman brought before me, he said finally, his voice rough. Do you know why, Rowan? Truly know why? Beyond the grief everyone assumes explains it? Tell me, Rowan said quietly. Because every single one of them looked at the crown before they ever looked at me, Caden said. They saw a title, a kingdom, a position worth securing, and somewhere beneath all of that, perhaps, a man they were willing to tolerate in exchange for what marrying him would grant them. I told myself for years that I simply had not found the right match. The truth is crueler than that. The truth is I stopped believing anyone could look at me and see anything beyond what I represented. Not since my mother died, believing the crown had taken everything from her that mattered. Rowan said nothing, letting the silence hold space for the confession continuing to unfold. Saren has never once looked at me that way, Caden continued. She cannot see the crown at all, Rowan, not with her eyes. And somehow that has meant she sees everything else more clearly than anyone ever has. My exhaustion, my fear, the scar I have never shown another living soul. She has seen all of it, and she has stayed anyway. Not because of what I represent, but because of who I actually am underneath all of it. His voice cracked slightly. And now she believes leaving is an act of love, when in truth, It would take from me the only person who has ever truly seen me at all." "Then go tell her exactly that," Rowan said gently. "Not tomorrow morning when it may already be too late. Now tonight, while there is still time to change her mind." Caden rose from the desk, something resolute settling into his expression despite the exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "Thank you, old friend." "Do not thank me," Rowan said, a small tired smile crossing his face. "Simply do not let her walk out that gate in the morning believing she is doing either of you a kindness." Caden made his way through the quiet corridors of the sleeping palace, rain still falling steadily outside, until he reached Saren's chamber and found her sitting awake by candlelight, her satchel still packed and resting beside the door, her hands folded quietly in her lap as though she too had found no rest that night. "You came back," she said, not turning, though she had clearly heard him approaching long before he reached the door. "I told you I would try until morning," Caden said, stepping inside and closing the door quietly behind him. "I have more to say than I managed earlier." "Then say it." He knelt in front of her, taking both her hands in his, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his voice shook openly as he spoke, stripped entirely of the careful control he had worn like armor since the day he first took the crown. "I have refused every woman brought before me for 7 years," he said, "because every single one of them saw a king before they ever saw a man. I convinced myself I simply had not found the right match, but the truth, Saren, the truth I have never told anyone until this very moment, is that I stopped believing anyone could love the person underneath the crown at all. Not since my mother took her own life believing that same crown had erased everything she once was." His voice broke slightly, and he pressed forward through it, refusing to stop now that the truth had finally begun spilling free. "You have never once looked at me and seen only a king. You found the scar I have hidden from everyone, and you did not flinch, did not pity me, simply kept working with steady hands as though I were still worth saving. You are the first person in 7 years who has touched me first, without hesitation, without fear, as though I were simply an ordinary man deserving ordinary comfort. And now you believe leaving is somehow protecting me, when in truth it would take away the only thing that has made me feel like myself again since I buried my mother in the ground." Saren sat very still, tears gathering silently at the corners of her eyes, her hands trembling slightly within his grip. "I am not asking you to stay because it is politically wise," Caden continued, his voice thick with emotion he could no longer hold back. "I am asking you to stay because I love you, Saren. Entirely and without condition, crown or no crown, challenge or no challenge. If Garrick wins because of that truth, then let him win. I would rather lose a crown honestly than keep it by losing you." Saren set down her folded hands and reached instead for his face, her fingers tracing gently along his jaw, feeling the tremor still running through him, the raw honesty he had never once allowed himself before this moment. "You are shaking," she said softly. "I have never told anyone the full truth of any of this," Caden said. "Not even Rowan, not entirely. It terrifies me more than facing Garrick ever could." "Then we are equally terrified," Saren said, her own voice unsteady now. "Because I packed that satchel telling myself it was an act of love, and some part of me has known all along it was simply an old fear, dressed up in nobler clothing." She reached down and, with steady, deliberate hands, unpacked the satchel resting beside the door, setting each item carefully back into its proper place. "I am not leaving," she said. "Not because it is politically convenient, because you told me the truth while shaking, and that mattered more to me than any argument Edwin's counsel could ever construct." Caden let out a breath that seemed to carry the weight of 7 long years, and Saren pulled him close, holding him steady the way she had held countless wounded warriors before him, not because he needed saving, but because he had finally allowed himself to be truly seen. Outside, the storm continued its steady rhythm against the windows, but inside that small chamber, something long buried had finally found air to breathe, and neither of them let go until the first gray light of morning began creeping quietly over the eastern hills. The morning of the new moon arrived cold and clear, the storm of the previous days finally spent, leaving the sky scrubbed pale and bright over the gathering crowd assembled in the great open field outside the palace walls. Every pack member had come to witness the challenge, standing in tense clusters across the frost-covered grass, their breath rising in pale clouds against the chill. Garrick arrived with his own procession shortly after midday, mounted on a dark horse, flanked by warriors whose confidence had clearly been fed by 10 days of spreading doubt. He dismounted at the center of the field with the easy arrogance of a man who believed he had already won before a single word was spoken. "Caden," Garrick called out, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd with practiced confidence. "I trust you have come prepared to answer my challenge, one way or another. Caden walked forward from the palace side of the field, Rowan a half-step behind him, the crowd parting silently to let him through. He wore no ceremonial armor, nothing designed to impress or intimidate, simply the plain, sturdy clothing of a man prepared to face whatever the day required. "I have come," Caden said, "and I have my answer." Garrick's eyes flicked past him, expecting perhaps an empty space where a chosen mate should have stood, ready to claim the victory he had spent 10 days building toward. Instead, he saw Seren step forward from the crowd, walking with steady, unhurried confidence across the frosted grass, her satchel left behind, her chin level, her presence entirely unbothered by the hundreds of eyes now turning to watch her. She reached Caden's side and, without hesitation, without announcement, reached out and took his hand. The gesture was simple. No grand declaration, no ceremonial words, nothing designed for spectacle. Just her hand steadying in his, the same matter-of-fact certainty with which she had once caught herself against his chest in a dark corridor months ago, treating him not as a king to be managed, but as a person deserving of ordinary, unguarded comfort. The crowd fell utterly silent. Garrick's confident expression flickered, uncertainty creeping into features that had, until that moment, carried nothing but assured superiority. "This is your answer," he said, his voice losing some of its earlier edge. "A healer who cannot even see the field she stands on." "This is my answer," Caden said, his voice carrying clear and unshaken across the frozen field. "Not because tradition demands a mate standing beside me today, but because this woman has seen me more clearly than anyone in 7 years, sight or no sight. She has healed children you never bothered to ask about. She has closed wounds on this very field where your own men bled 10 days ago during an ambush your warriors carried out under cover of darkness. If seeing clearly is the measure of strength this pack requires, then I have found the strongest partner any king could ask for." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Seren felt it shift, uncertainty giving way slowly to something else entirely, respect gathering like warmth returning to frozen ground. The old elder woman who had spoken in council days before stepped forward from the crowd, her voice carrying clear and unwavering. "My grandson lives today because of hands you now mock, Garrick," she called out. "I would rather stand behind a king who chooses courage over convenience than one who hides behind 10 days of whispered doubt." More voices rose in agreement, warriors who had watched Seren work through fever outbreaks and battlefield wounds alike, pack members who had quietly come to respect the steady competence they had witnessed with their own eyes over the past weeks. Garrick looked out across the field, watching the tide of the crowd's mood shift firmly away from him, his earlier confidence draining visibly from his posture. "This changes nothing about the terms of the challenge," Garrick said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier certainty. "Then let us settle it as you originally proposed," Caden said calmly. "Combat, if that is truly what you still wish, though I suspect you will find far less support behind you today than you believed you had built over these past 10 days. Garrick's eyes swept across the assembled crowd once more, taking in the shifted mood, the quiet solidarity gathering visibly around Caden and the woman standing steady at his side. Whatever calculation ran behind his eyes in that long, silent moment, it seemed to settle on something far less certain than the victory he had ridden onto that field expecting. "Perhaps," Garrick said slowly, "this matter does not require blood spilled today after all." "Perhaps it does not," Caden agreed evenly, "though the choice remains entirely yours to make." Garrick studied him a moment longer, then looked toward Seren, who stood unmoved, unbothered, her hand still steady in Caden's, her presence carrying none of the fragility he had clearly expected to find. Something in his expression shifted, grudging acknowledgement replacing earlier arrogance, and finally, he inclined his head slightly, a gesture that fell somewhere between concession and respect. "Then I withdraw the challenge," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear clearly. "For now." He turned and mounted his horse without further ceremony, his warriors falling in behind him, and the procession rode back toward the Eastern Territory in silence, leaving behind a field full of pack members whose earlier doubt had transformed, over the course of a single morning, into something far closer to quiet pride. Caden did not look toward the departing riders. He looked instead at Seren, standing steady beside him, her face turned slightly toward the sound of his breathing, unable to see the relief and love written openly across his features, needing nothing more than the warmth of his hand in hers to understand exactly what the moment held. "It is done," he said quietly, "just for her." "It is only beginning," Seren said, a small, certain smile crossing her face. "But I find myself unafraid of what comes next, for the first time in longer than I can remember." Around them, the crowd began to disperse slowly, voices rising into quiet, hopeful conversation, the frost beginning to melt beneath the climbing sun. Caden lifted Saren's hand gently and pressed a kiss against her knuckles, right there in front of everyone, no longer caring who witnessed the gesture. She could not see the way the whole field seemed to soften at the sight of it, warriors and elders alike exchanging glances that spoke of a future none of them had expected, but many of them, in that quiet moment, found themselves ready to welcome. She did not need to see it. She simply held his hand a little tighter and let the morning sun warm both their faces as the pack, slowly and surely, began to make room in its heart for the healer who had never once needed her eyes to see exactly what mattered most.